We're here to talk about the Phosphorus Site Index Update, now known as the Phosphorus Management Tool. I'm going to go into, they tell me I got about an hour. We should have plenty of time for questions. I'm guessing that this talk's going to take me maybe 40, 45 minutes, and I did that so we'd have plenty of time for discussion and to answer some questions. And I guess my role is mainly to tell you why we started looking at this, what we've changed, and a little bit of the science behind it. So nutrient management planning, a lot of this is going to be an overview for many of you. The Phosphorus Management Tool is just one component of Maryland's agricultural nutrient management planning process. And the PMD is an update of the PSI. A lot of, we've all, someone told me that this morning the Baltimore News was covering the PMT. It must be a slow news morning in Baltimore. It's great as a soil fertility person to get some press, I guess. But a lot of people are treating this like it's a new regulation. I guess there are new parts of the nutrient management regulation, but the PMT is not new. As a matter of fact, most of it is exactly the same as the old P index that all of you should be very familiar with. It's just an update of the evolution of the P index, and we happened to change the name this time around because we felt like P index really doesn't mean anything, whereas Phosphorus Management Tool gets at what the P index does. It helps you to manage your phosphorus. So that goes to the name change. It's a tool for assessing relative risk from P loss from an agricultural production field, just like the PSI. Initially, when the first P index was created, and I've seen a copy of the first P index, it's on a cocktail napkin. You got to figure the P index was made in a bar after a lot of drinking. And those guys, it's a tough crowd, early in the morning, lights are dim. Those guys, they said, I've got some manure here, some dairy manure, and I've got 10 different fields. Which one do I take it to that? And that's what the P index was. It was to help rank in a relative fashion those 10 fields and which one had the lowest risk of phosphorus loss. You said, I can apply this manure to any of these 10 fields. Which one presents the lowest relative risk relative to the other fields? It's not an absolute measure. It's not a quantitative measure like a model. Like a model, if you ran a phosphorus model on a field, and I mean a good model, we're not talking about the Chesapeake Bay model here, we're talking about a field-based, I shouldn't pick on the Chesapeake Bay model. Everyone else does that enough. So a field-based model, it says 10 pounds per acre of phosphorus loss from this field. But this is not that. This is saying this field has a higher potential than that field. And so it's relative between the fields. And so I should put my manure here. And then over time, it's evolved to incorporate more about management. So also, instead of just saying I have these 10 fields and I can put manure, this field presents the lowest relative risk, the Phosphorus Management Tool also says, how can I apply that manure to reduce the risk? Okay, and that's really important. And that's at the university, that's our main goal with the PMT, is to try and bring this management to the forefront. I think we focus on a lot of things. Mainly we focus on, can I apply manure or can't I apply manure? But there's a lot more that goes into it, right? How do I apply it? When do I apply it? What is the crop rotation that I'm applying it to? And so the idea is for you to run iterations of the phosphorus index or the PMT and keep running it with different management scenarios until you get the lowest risk, because we want you to use a suite of management practices that present the lowest relative risk for phosphorus loss from that field. So you run it one time and you get a score of 50. You run it and you say, I'm going to go to no-till, and you get a score of 40. Then you're going to say, I'm going to run it with injected manure, and my score is 20. And so that's the best way to manage the manure in that field as far as phosphorus loss is concerned. Maybe not for crop production, but for phosphorus loss, that's what this focuses on. The other thing, kind of basics, background, introduction to soil science 101. Some of you might not have known this, but phosphorus and nitrogen are different. That was a joke. I expect everyone in the room knows that phosphorus and nitrogen are different. And they behave different in the soil. They have different cycles, and so therefore their management must be different. And so this goes into the justification for using something like the PMT. So phosphorus is not like nitrogen. Probably less than 15% of the phosphorus applied is available in the first year, especially in low P soils. So if I apply starter fertilizer or broadcast MAP or manure, probably less than 15% of that phosphorus is available to that crop in the first year. And that's 15% is if I'm managing it really well. That's a starter band close to the row where you have a high concentration and good diffusion to the plant. So most of the phosphorus, and this is why we're in trouble in some areas as far as environmental loss of phosphorus, most of that phosphorus gets tied up in the soil. And for years, for decades, we told farmers bankroll phosphorus. Apply it while it's cheap and it'll be there when the price goes up, right? Because it doesn't move out of the soil and it's available in following years. But this is important from an environmental standpoint too. It's important from a crop production standpoint, but from an environmental standpoint, it's important to understand that reductions in rate will not improve efficiency in many situations, whereas with nitrogen it does. Nitrogen use efficiency, the highest level of efficiency is the first pound of nitrogen you apply, right? If we look at that yield response curve, because all of my fertilizer nitrogen is getting to that crop, I don't have any residual. If we want to minimize nitrogen loss, we want to try and apply the right rate for crop removal and get that high nitrogen use efficiency. So increases in nitrogen use efficiency yield benefit environmentally. But with phosphorus, that's not true. Phosphorus use efficiency, the percentage of my phosphorus fertilizer that gets into the crop, has a dubious if non-existent relationship with environmental loss. And the prime example of this in a metascale is, do you know what region in the United States has the highest phosphorus use efficiency in the United States? Guess. Anyone in the audience? No? I'm deaf. You got to yell. The North Central Plains. Do you know what region, according to the EPA, has the highest phosphorus loss to surface waters? The North Central Plains. So phosphorus use efficiency does not equate to environmental protection of that phosphorus. Why? Because a lot of phosphorus is lost in erosion. So I can do everything right, but if I till my soil up, it goes off, right? I might not apply any phosphorus, in which case my fertilizer phosphorus efficiency is sky high. And yet, because I have high soil P, I might have a slow leak of phosphorus and have very high losses, right? My soil test P is 1,000. I didn't apply any phosphorus, so my use efficiency for fertilizer, my partial factor efficiency is sky high. But I had very high loss because of the residual in the soil. So we have to manage phosphorus differently than nitrogen. For environmental protection, agronomic phosphorus use efficiency doesn't help us, so that's not really our goal. We have to protect that phosphorus that's in the soil from loss, which is a whole different discussion. So why P management? Everyone in the room should know this. P is essential to all forms of life on Earth. It has no known toxic effects, right? And we need adequate levels for production of agronomic crops. But the trick is, it also limits algae production in freshwater systems. So it's the limiting nutrient in many freshwater systems, like the Great Lakes and Lake Erie. They're having huge problems with this because it's going to limit eutrophication, because a lot of those algae are nitrogen fixers. So nitrogen is not the limiting factor, the phosphorus is. So phosphorus is really responsible for our current levels of production globally in agriculture. A lot of people think nitrogen, but nitrogen, we could always get plenty of nitrogen from manures historically back in the 18th century, 19th century, before the advent of phosphorus. You could use cover crops and manures and things like that, but as they developed phosphorus fertilizer around the mid-1800s, that's really what allowed us to see the potential for nitrogen fertilizer, right? Because we had Chilean nitrate and all of these things, but we were limited by phosphorus in crop production. And then, as the phosphorus fertilizer industry developed in the late 1800s, then yields exploded worldwide, and we were able to avoid the Malthusian catastrophe, right? That populations would outgrow our crop supply. And phosphorus is really what's responsible for about 60% of the calories we produce worldwide. So it's a very important agricultural nutrient. So how does phosphorus loss occur? And this is what we'll be talking about mostly going forward here. There's two factors when we talk about phosphorus loss from a field: source and transport. It's very simple, all right? You've got a phosphorus source, applied fertilizers or manures or direct deposition from animals, and then you've got a transport pathway. And there's three dominant transport pathways. In most areas, there's only two. A very small percentage of the world has three transport pathways. Mainly, we're concerned with erosion, which we've been preaching for decades now, because phosphorus binds tightly to soil. And so if you control soil erosion, you'll control most of the phosphorus loss from a field. But once we elevate soil phosphorus to a level where the soil can't hold it anymore, the soil's like a cup, right? And we can saturate it, and then we have dissolved phosphorus that's available for loss and runoff, or if we surface apply fertilizers or manures, that surface source is very soluble, and the precipitation can run across it and carry dissolved peat away to the surface water. And then the third pathway is really only a factor in intensively drained fields where we have a shallow water table, such as the lower eastern shore. Ditch drain, agricultural systems, and this is really some of the new science that really influenced the PMT, is that on the lower shore, just because of the hydrology there's a high transport potential. And so you have large loads of phosphorus traveling shallow subsurface pathways. And what happens, and we'll get into this more in a minute, is there's two main ways that this happens. But first, you've got to have really high soil saturation, extremely high soil saturation. So normal conditions aren't a factor here. So we filled that soil up full of phosphorus, groundwater is pretty close by, and then we intensively drain that area, and you get shallow transport in the top foot or so, really. And then there can be deeper leaching, but that's really rare around here. There's some concern with that in karst topography, but it's a minimal area that's covered by. So why not use a critical value? Well, a critical value is like a soil test threshold, where we say above 100 FIV, right, soil test, you're not allowed to apply any more phosphorus, because your crops won't respond to it. You're not going to have a crop response once you get out. You know, the probability is extremely low of having crop response in high soil P. But why don't we just say above 150 FIV, just cut it off, forget the P index, it's simpler for everyone. And obviously from a regulatory perspective, this would be much simpler. But the best science indicates that all fields aren't equal in delivery, and that transport factor mainly is what we're talking about. The source might be the same across fields, they might all have the same soil test P, but that transport pathway is much different. And so if you're going to have an environmental rule, I would argue that you should have an environmental tool to accomplish that, and not use an agronomic tool, which is what the malic-free soil extraction is. It's an agronomic tool. And so you'd be putting a square peg in a round hole if you just use soil tests. So although not agronomically efficient to apply phosphorus to that high P field, right, because you're not getting a response to that phosphorus, it may be economically optimal because of the cost of transporting manure, or the benefit of that manure that's not phosphorus related. I have a lot of people tell me, like, man, I'm going to lose a lot of yield if I stop putting manure on this field. And their soil test phosphorus is 900. You know, so well above agronomic optimum. Well, that's not a phosphorus response that they're seeing. That's probably a response to the liming factor, the pH, the organic matter, something along those lines, the micronutrients or the nitrogen in that manure, but it's not a phosphorus response. But it's still economically optimum to put that manure there, not environmentally optimum, but economically optimum, because they're getting a response to these other characteristics in the manure and because of the cost of transport. So that's why we allow phosphorus to be applied on high P fields. We're saying it's an environmental risk. Let's use a tool that assesses that environmental risk and move that manure to the least risky situation, right? So an environmental tool for an environmental rule, not, because agronomically, soil test isn't the only decision factor. A threshold value could also lead to application of manure to lower P fields, but with a higher potential for runoff. Because remember I said, it's really the transport is the key here. So if we just said all high P fields, we're going to cut them off, there's a risk there that you would then be putting manure on lower P fields with a higher transport factor, and there are some examples of this. So here's a case study out of Pennsylvania. Phosphorus was measured in surface runoff during natural storm events between 2001 and 2004, and it was a strict crop watershed up in central Pennsylvania. The upper two fields had a high soil phosphorus, not super high, but above agronomic optimum, 144 and 177. That's milligrams per kilogram malic-free is roughly FIV, so you can just think of it as being, that was their Maryland FIV. And these fields routinely received dairy manure and fertilizer, starter P. And the field closest to the stream was a grass buffer. It hadn't had any phosphorus applications, and while still up agronomically optimum of 78 FIV, but much lower, half the phosphorus of the other two fields. And in this situation, these bars indicate the phosphorus load from each of those three areas of the field in kilograms per hectare per year, and 8 kilograms per hectare per year of phosphorus in runoff is a very high number. That's a lot of phosphorus loss. Again, environmental risk and agronomic risk are not the same, because that's a very low number agronomically, right? Because I find it funny sometimes when you talk to people that don't necessarily work in agriculture, and they say, well, we're doing farmers a favor because if we limit environmental loss, economically that's better for them. Well, 8 kilograms per year of phosphorus loss is not an environmental hit to a farm when you consider all the other things going on. It's not an economic hit. It's an environmentally substantial amount of phosphorus, but not economically. So efficiency and environmental loss with phosphorus don't always equate. So this huge amount of phosphorus leaving the lowest soil test P area. And then the other two are nominal, 1 kilogram per hectare per year and less than 1 kilogram per hectare per year in the highest soil test phosphorus field. And what was the difference? It was the amount of water leaving the field. That low soil test P area had huge amount of water. The riparian zone had 46-fold greater amount of water runoff volume than the other two fields combined. So while we had the highest source on the upper fields, we had the lowest transport risk. And if we had just used soil test P and said, I'm going to put my manure on the lowest soil test P, we would have made this problem exponentially worse. So that's why we use an environmental tool when it comes to phosphorus and not an agronomic tool. Management over phosphorus source. Again, why do we use the phosphorus management tool or the P index? Because management probably plays the largest role in controlling phosphorus loss. It's not necessarily the amount of phosphorus applied. It's not necessarily the soil test P. The transport's a big factor, and then managing the source and the transport through the decisions we make in phosphorus is huge. So here's a study, 2006 data, and this is cumulative phosphorus load from 4 different tillage practices at the Y Research Center over on the Eastern Shore. And what those are is, whoa, sensitive mouse. That's no-till, that's turbo-till or vertical tillage, that's a strip till, that's chisel plow. Went across these fields, replicated fields, collected all the runoff. We did this study for 3 years, but we really only had measurable runoff after application in the first year. The interesting thing is tillage didn't have an effect on runoff P when there was a long distance between the first measurable runoff and the application time. We needed 2 inches of rain in a 24-hour period to get runoff from this site, and in 2007 and 2008 we just didn't get any runoff, right? But in 2006 we did, and this is total phosphorus loss in kilograms per hectare, and we see that with increasing degree of tillage, we had decreasing degree of phosphorus loss in this field. Now in this field, sediment-bound phosphorus wasn't a risk. It was relatively flat, gentle slopes. Erosion wasn't our risk factor here. If we ran the P index, it would have said that particulate P wasn't our real risk. Surface dissolved P was the risk in this situation. And what we see is that by chisel plowing with only 11% residue left, we have much less phosphorus loss. Same soil test P, same manure application, just incorporate the manure. Management had a huge impact on phosphorus loss. So agronomic soil tests are not calibrated to environmental loss. It can be agronomically appropriate to apply manure even if the soil test says no P is needed. So there's not going to be a response to the phosphorus, but there is a response to nitrogen, organic matter, pH, micronutrients. There's a transport cost of that manure to send it to another farm that has to be considered. So the agronomically appropriate rate may be higher than what's needed for the phosphorus, just the phosphorus alone. Manure has a lot going with it other than phosphorus. So we needed a tool to guide this nutrient application while minimizing environmental loss. And that's where the P index came in. So this, everyone should have seen this at some point, is this is an agronomic soil test, for phosphorus. It could be for anything, where we have a soil test value here on the x-axis and relative yield on the y-axis. And when your soil test is low, you're going to lose yield if you don't apply phosphorus. Medium, there's a probability you're going to lose some yield. And then in the optimum range, you've maximized your yield. And then with phosphorus, as we go into what we consider excessive, above 100, again, you're not going to get a response by added phosphorus. So down here in those below 50, according to Maryland recommendations, below a soil test of 50 FIV phosphorus, you're going to get a response to adding phosphorus. So this is what an agronomic test looks like. This is what an environmental test looks like. Notice that the shapes of the curves are different. So we can't use an agronomic test like Mehlich-3 to guide phosphorus application because the shapes of these are different. So all I've done is put the phosphorus management tool here on the x-axis and the relative risk of phosphorus transport on the y-axis. It's an environmental test. Now instead of measuring one thing against yield, which is what Mehlich-3 does, now we're measuring the phosphorus management tool against P transport risk, and we're saying that basically in the low range, because of low source or low transport or good management, you have very low risk for phosphorus transport, and then as you move up through that medium level, there's increasing risk, and then we kind of, on a relative scale compared to other fields, have maximized the risk once we get into that high range. And we do use soil test phosphorus as the first hurdle, because we said, well, we can't have everyone run the PMT, it's too onerous. So they said, all right, 3 times the agronomic optimum, right? We hit the agronomic optimum at 50, let's go 3 times that, set it really high, and at 150, you've got to run the PMT, okay? Now, we're still way out of environmental risk, kind of at 150, we don't see a lot of potential for environmental loss of phosphorus. You're not at that super saturated zone yet, but it's still 3 times the agronomic optimum. I really don't worry when I look at soils that are like 150 generally. I mean, it's high, and you don't need the phosphorus, but typically, if I'm just looking at soil tests, it's not that big a deal. But it is 3 times the agronomic optimum, so that was a decision made back in the late 90s when all the regulations first started coming around of that's when you have to start running the P-index. So that's the other kind of misconception that I've seen a lot of in the press here concerning the PMT. It seems like when people talk about it, they're like, well, I'm going to be cut off when my soil test hits 150. Well, that's not true. When your soil test hits 150, if you want to apply phosphorus, then you got to run the PMT to see how much, when, where can I apply. The cutoff's not 150. That's just when you have to start thinking about it. You've got a long way to go before you're going to be cut off, hopefully. So the old phosphorus site index, this is the first big change. The old phosphorus site index, the interpretive values here, these are really kind of policy sort of decisions that are based on kind of science of, well, if your risk is low, what can you do? And we figure that most people, when they're applying manure under the old way, right, and this was got a lot of us in trouble, when you apply, say, poultry manure at an N-based rate to supply all your nitrogen, which rarely occurs now, right, because mostly a lot of us are side dressing nitrogen in behind a poultry layer application, so you're probably, hopefully, only putting down half or 3/4 of your total nitrogen need when you apply manure. But we figure N-based planting is like the bare minimum. Like that's what people want to do, is N-based planting with the manure, put 6 tons of manure out there and walk away from it, right? So under low, we let you keep doing that, because we said, well, phosphorus isn't a risk, just operate around nitrogen, because nitrogen is tied to use efficiency, the environmental loss there. Medium, you start to get into some risky situation. You're building, if you keep doing what you did, that N-based application where you're applying 3 to 5 times too much phosphorus, then you're going to cause yourself problems in the future and have environmental problems in the future. So we're going to transition you into a situation where you can still do N-based planting 1 out of 3 years, but 2 out of 3 you have to do P-based planting. And then once you get to the high, it's like, whoa, you're in a bad situation here. You've caused yourself problems from applying phosphorus beyond crop removal for many years. The risk of environmental loss is pretty high on this field. So we're going to limit it to P-based planting only on that field. And then very high is way out there, and very few people fell into this category. And we say no P should be applied to this site, and implement active remediation techniques, which just basically means keep cropping that field. That's really the only remediation we have. Keep cropping that field to reduce P loss. So Maryland PSI performance, how did the old one work? I'd like to say that actually the authors of the old P-index did a very good job. I was in graduate school. I actually remember when this study was done, people I shared an office with did this study with Dr. Cole and Dr. Latham and Dr. Sims, and they did this study. They looked at 646 fields between 99 and 2000 and said, using the Maryland P-index, what's the performance going to be? And generally we figure that the critical area, the area that contributes phosphorus to runoff, is about 5% of the landscape. Now, it's interesting because we do the P-index, I'll get into this a little bit more later, for the whole field. You get a score for the whole field. But really, when we say 5% of the landscape, we mean 5% of the landscape. But they kind of designed the P-index around capturing 5% of the fields because that's the way we run it on the whole field. We don't have the capability yet to do a variable P-index across the field, but we'd like to work towards that. So what they found was about 70% of the field scored low, could keep on with the N-based planting, and then about 30% of the fields would have had some sort of restriction in phosphorus application, with only 4% in the very high. P-based planting 2 out of 3, P-based planting only, and no P application. So then between 2001 and 2008, University of Maryland Extension ran many P-indexes as part of nutrient management planning in the counties, and that's about 9,000 fields. And when we look at that data, it shook out just about like what Dr. Cole's study said the P-index would do. So they did what they set out to do. So that's the other myth I'd like to dispel. Everyone said the old P-index was a failure because everyone could do whatever they wanted. Not necessarily. We actually found it was a little more restrictive than Dr. Cole predicted. And so, about 35% of the fields were restricted and couldn't apply N-based planting. So the P-index did exactly what they kind of predicted that it would do and restricted a certain percentage of the landscape. If we assume that those 9,000 fields are representative of the landscape, which I think with that sample size is a fairly safe assumption. So these are all the factors that go into the P-index. And the difference between the old P-index and the phosphorus management tool, you can look at these two columns. The old P-index did not have soil phosphorus saturation ratio. We'll get into that. The new one does. And then we deleted, so we added one thing, soil phosphorus saturation, and we deleted two things. The priority, water body priority status, because all water bodies have been determined to be high priority, relative to phosphorus loss, and so it's just an extra step that wasn't necessary. And the P leaching, we found there was a P leaching component in the old one and a subsurface drainage potential, and they were redundant. They told us the same things, so it wasn't necessary to have both. So we deleted that to simplify the situation. The rest of these things are the same. The old P-index and the new PMT are extremely similar. This is the major change. We went from 4 factors, interpretive categories, to 3. So we got rid of very high and just squished that down in with the high. And the reason for this is, this was more of a policy decision. This was not necessarily one way or the other. The science doesn't really have an opinion on this. It's not against it, it's not for it. It's just, it is what it is. And the reason was the NRCS came out with guidance because many of the states have very different P-indexes. If you were farming on the line of Virginia and Maryland and had one field in Virginia and one field in Maryland, you had to run P-index on those 2 fields, Virginia's would be much different than Maryland's, although more similar than, say, if you ran Oklahoma's P-index. And the feds were looking at this under the 590 standard and saying we need to have more consistency. Some of the P-indexes never had a cutoff period, and so the NRCS said, look, under the 590 standard, we want them all to have some consistent guidelines. And one of the recommendations was it said it should have at least 3 categories. So 4 would have been all right, but the policy folks in Maryland kind of felt like, well, if they're saying at least 3, there must be a reason, let's go to 3, which is fine. And then the interpretive categories changed as well. Low before, remember, was N-based planting. Now with low, you can apply a 3-year crop removal rate in 1 year, which generally is very close to N-based planting. It's very similar to what most people do. We just wanted to put everything in terms of phosphorus. It didn't make sense in the phosphorus index to have a nitrogen recommendation, so we just said, let's put it all in terms of phosphorus so you can put that 3-year crop removal rate on in one shot. Then medium, we say, well, you're going to start to run into problems here if you keep doing what you're doing with applying that 3-year crop removal rate. So it's the same amount of phosphorus over 3 years, but we're going to make you put out smaller amounts each year. So it's the 1-year phosphorus removal rate is what you're limited to under medium. So it brings that field into balance. You're taking off what you're putting in, and your soil test P should stay consistent or drop slowly. And then high is the same as the old very high, where you're just cut off. So we went to 3 categories, and that's the major change. So we're talking about this critical source area, and under the old P-index, you lumped all the transport pathways, surface, subsurface, sediment-bound P, and then you multiplied them times your source and management, which were kind of lumped together, and you were trying to find that area where both were high. High transport and high source is the critical source area. And then we said, okay, this is our new concept where we're going to bring management out and really have more focus on the management, because that's what we can control. The soil test P you have now, you're going to be stuck at for 100 to 200 years. That's it. You're stuck. And so you can't control soil test P. And you can't control slope or transport, which is slope and soil type generally. But you can control your management, so we want to put more focus on that and give you more options, and we're still working to build more options. And then finally we said, we're going to have to separate this out by pathways, because what was happening was, on the lower eastern shore, if I had a dish-drained field, and all of my transport occurred during subsurface, but I had very low surface transport, that was getting averaged together, and I was coming up with a medium score. But that wasn't accurate, because I did have high P loss through one pathway. So what we've done is basically created 3 separate P indexes, if you will. One for surface dissolved P and runoff, one for subsurface dissolved P, in that subsurface pathway in intensively drained fields, and then 1 for particulate phosphorus across those surface pathways. And then you add them together to get your cumulative risk. So if you're on the Lower Eastern Shore, basically your 2 surface factors should be close to 0, and the subsurface would be all your transport. And then if you're over here, let's say, and you don't have any drainage, subsurface drainage, the surface is going to be really what's important, and the subsurface is going to be set equal to 0. So this is appropriate in areas where that one pathway dominates. So this is the other major change. Those are the 2 things that really changed between the old P-index and the PMT. So to get into the calculation, which I'm not going to focus real heavily on the nuts and bolts of how to do the calculation, mainly because everyone's using software to do this, and also mainly because everyone's capable of doing arithmetic. You can just use the worksheet if you don't use the software. But just to give you an idea of the science behind it and what the concepts are. So the old one was that part A times the part B, source and management times transport. And the new is that dissolved P equals source times management times transport, plus particulate P risk is equal to source times management times transport, and subsurface P is source times management times transport. So to talk about subsurface drainage, this is the area familiar to anyone from the Eastern Shore that is where we're talking about subsurface transport occurs. Now, I've been getting some questions as I talk about this. What's a ditch? How do you qualify a ditch? How do you qualify this? That's really a kind of regulatory question. From the university's perspective, the PMT is a management tool, and it requires you to engage your brain and use some common sense. I know that doesn't fit with regulatory policy all the time, but it's an important distinction. You know whether or not this is your landscape where you have subsurface P transport. This is subsurface transport area right here. That groundwater is right up, 6 inches off of the surface. We got ditches every 100 yards. That's an intensively drained field, and all the phosphorus, 95% of it anyway, is going through subsurface pathways. And so what do? We created this risk factor for subsurface drainage that incorporates the hydrologic soil group and says, you have a higher risk when you are in that hydrologic soil group A or D, and hydrologic soil groups B and C is a little lower risk, and then we look at the drainage category, very poorly drained versus excessively drained. And the reason that we did that is because there's basically 2 ways that phosphorus moves in a subsurface pathway, okay? How many of you are from the Eastern Shore and have seen a ditch drain field? Okay, good number of people. Okay, so there's 2 ways that phosphorus moves in subsurface transport. I'm going to explain this to you here. You've got, are you all familiar with the term white oak ground? Like an Othello soil? It's that sticky, freezes twice a year in July and January, right? Gets slick and gray and hard. So you get macropore flow in those fields. Okay, you've got cracks, you've got wormholes, let's say it's no-till, right? So you get macropore flow, and you've got water close to the surface or a confining layer. And the phosphorus, if you've got very high soil saturation in the surface, right? Let's say I've applied poultry litter and now my soil test is up around 800 FID. My degree of phosphorus saturation is 90%. All right, I'm very saturated in the surface. Rain hits that soil and travels very quickly through those macropores. And so you get mass flow of water to that confining layer or the groundwater that moves laterally quickly to the ditch. And there's been tracer studies that have shown that that water that falls on the soil surface in the center of that field is in that ditch within 24 hours. This is a rapid process of transfer, okay? And this water dissolves the phosphorus from the saturated soil or the manure that's laying on the surface and carries this dissolved P through those big holes in the soil over to the ditch. So that's one way that phosphorus is transported in a ditch drain system. And a way to stop that is to break up that macropore flow with some tillage, okay? So management can control a little bit of this, but in general, it's a highly connected system with high risk of transport. On the other end of the spectrum, there's another way that phosphorus can move, and this is through matrix flow. So mass flow or macropore flow is when water's moving through big channels, right? Because soils, here's a little bit of soil science, soils have capillary flow, right? They have capillary action, like have you guys ever gone to give blood and they take the little glass tube and your blood sucks up in the tube? That's capillary flow. The walls of that glass tube hold the blood. It's the same with water and soil. This piece of soil will hold the water. But you can get coarse textured soils like sands, and water trickles through all the little particles of that soil, right? And that's matrix flow through the soil, shallow groundwater table, coarse texture soil, and the phosphorus is dissolved from that soil. And in this case, what normally happens is the groundwater comes up in the winter, hits the saturated zone, and we have deep saturation from 50 years of very high manure application. And so the groundwater comes up and hits the saturated zone. Once that soil goes anaerobic, because the water has inundated it, it'll dissolve all the P off the iron and aluminum oxides and take it to the ditch. So that ditch is dry in the summertime, the water comes up, dissolves the phosphorus from the soil, and it just moves through the water to that ditch. Okay, so it's two very different situations, and that's kind of generally how we think phosphorus moves in a ditch drain system. And these risk factors are an attempt to capture that water flow, which is really drainage intensity. So drainage intensity is the distance between ditches, a ratio of the distance between ditches, and the depth of those ditches. And the depth of those ditches, you'll have deep ditches further apart where you have matrix flow, and then you'll have shallow ditches close together in those heavier ground with confining layer. That's what we find. And so we end up with two very different situations, and that's why this thing has an inflection, where in the middle we kind of have low risk and then higher risk on each end. And then the management is different for the subsurface component than for the surface components. And there's a push-pull here. Remember, this is intended to be extremely site-specific, okay? Speaker's buzzing at me. This is site-specific. So in areas where erosion is a problem, there's going to be a push-pull here, right? And we don't expect it on the lower eastern shore, but what we say is that, you know, it's better to have some tillage on these heavier soils because it'll mix up those macropores where you have subsurface loss. Erosion's not a factor because there's no slope, so we're going to give you credit for having more tillage in this kind of situation. And if you did more tillage, say, in Washington County, Maryland, your score would go up. If you do more tillage in, say, Somerset County, Maryland, your score is probably going to go down. It's a site-specific tool. It's not a one-size-fits-all deal when it comes to agriculture. So we have these different methods of application and timings for the subsurface factor. If you don't apply any, your risk is zero, obviously. If you incorporate it within 5 days with good soil mixing, you basically decrease your risk by 70% about. If you incorporate it within 5 days with soil mixing, but in the winter time, then you can only decrease your score 60%. So these management practices are actually decreasing your score, right? They're not adding to your score because they're less than 1. And when you multiply, if you have a score of 100, you multiply it by 0.8, your score is 80, right? So these management factors bring your score down. So you look at these factors and figure out how to manage your phosphorus to decrease that risk. So subsurface source is total P applied. The solubility of that phosphorus applied, this is straight from the old P index. That PSC, phosphorus solubility coefficient, the more soluble the source, the higher the risk. And the soil P solubility. This is the new part. So this is another big major change. Before, we just used malic-free P. Now we're using malic-free P for the subsurface part, for the dissolved components, the surface dissolved and the subsurface dissolved P. Instead of just using soil test P, because not all soils are created equally. Remember how I said soil is a glass, and you can fill it up and then it overflows with phosphorus? The size of that glass is determined by how much iron and aluminum you have in the soil. Okay? So, more iron and aluminum you have, the more phosphorus your soil can hold. So we now use the DPS, which is basically phosphorus divided by iron plus aluminum. There are 2 labs now that currently report this on their soil test report, stock and trade, they just do. And all the labs that cover this region, unless there's some fly-by-night back alley Baltimore lab that I don't know about, they all said that they'll report this if it's asked for. They may charge you for it, but obviously they don't want to lose business to the 2 people who are already and have been reporting this for 5 years probably now. So this is out there. It's the degree of phosphorus saturation. The equation is available for it in the PMT technical guide. So even if the lab won't do the calculation for you, you can plug your numbers into that equation and come up with DPS on your own. It's a relatively simple math. And so it's a more fair way of site-specific assessment of risk. Instead of just using soil test P of 900 on a field with high iron and aluminum is not the same as 900 on one with low iron and aluminum. And so we're trying to give credit to people who naturally just have higher retention in their soils. Moving on to surface dissolved P. again, distance times transport times source. And distance is a function of distance and land cover over that distance. Now remember, there wasn't a distance in subsurface. That's because in subsurface phosphorus transport and ditch drain landscapes, distance from that ditch doesn't have an impact. It's highly connected, and so that distance factor is nominal there. So that's why we don't having a grass buffer around a ditch doesn't help you, because a subsurface pathway circumvents that buffer. It goes under it. The buffer doesn't reduce phosphorus loss. Okay, so this is another thing that we've been kind of critical of. Is if I'm in a ditch drain field, putting in a grass buffer does not help reduce phosphorus loss. It may help with nitrogen, it may help with other things, but it doesn't help with phosphorus loss. So you don't get credit for that in subsurface loss. You do in the surface. So transport is a function of soil permeability and slope. It's the exact same function as in the old P index. Nothing changed. And source is a function of the soil soluble P, the manure soluble P, and how the manure was applied. The management factors did change, but the other stuff's the same as the old index. So what's changed here is the distance factor is a little different. Transport is identical, and then with source it's a little bit different. That distance factor, this is uses the return period threshold. It's much different than the old distance factor. Basically, if you're greater than 500 feet from a ditch, your P-index surface dissolved P-score will be decreased by 80%. Okay? And then if you're right up less than one, or not a ditch, excuse me, a stream. If you're less than 100 feet, we're saying you're within that contributing area to that stream. And so this is a hydrologic function designed by hydrologists that says what's the contributing area to that stream. The buffer factor, which is combined with the distance factor, is a 50-foot vegetated NRCS buffer, reduces your score by 20%. A greater than 35-foot permanent vegetated buffer reduces your score by 10%. If you have less than a 35-foot buffer, you don't get any reduction in your score, but it's a good thing. The surface runoff factor then is the same as the old one with slope by permeability class. Nothing's changed there. It's taken directly from the old index. So runoff is the distance buffer factor times that surface runoff factor plus the dissolved phosphorus risk factor, which is like the subsurface one where it uses method of application, the amount of P applied, the phosphorus solubility coefficient, and that DPS. Same as the old one, but the management options are different because it's a push-pull. What's good for reducing phosphorus and runoff is not good for reducing phosphorus and subsurface drainage. Luckily, they shouldn't occur at the same time. And so we have a little bit different application factors. If you inject your manure, let's say you got dairy manure and you can inject it, subsurface placement or immediate full incorporation with greater than 90% residue. So I've maintained residue and I've injected my manure into the surface. So basically we're talking about dairy manure injection. Your score will be decreased by 80%. So here's the other myth. All over the paper, everyone's saying, the PMT is just going to cut everyone off. No, not necessarily. You can select management options that are going to eliminate your risk. Will you? I don't know. Is it cost effective? Probably not if you've got to go out and buy an injection. But there's a difference between can't and will, right? I always tell people that. There's a right, Nicole? My graduate students in the back. There's a difference between can't and won't. All right? So when you say, I can't inject, no, you won't inject. And you may have very good reasons for not injecting, right? I mean, you're not going to get a lot of sympathy. I'm not a sympathetic person. It's the other thing my graduate students will tell you. I'm very unsympathetic. But, you know, there are options that will almost eliminate all of your risk. Particulate P. Distance from surface water, because this is kind of a filter for reducing that score. Sediment loss is calculated using Russell 2 or Russell, and then soil test P. So basically your management is wrapped up into Russell. If everyone's familiar with Russell, you have your management in there, you have your site factors like slope and soil type are all in there, so that's all wrapped up in the Russell score. And basically we're saying Russell sediment loss times soil test P. In this situation, we're not using degree of phosphorus saturation, because if you're moving the soil particle, the solubility of the phosphorus on that particle doesn't make a lot of difference. So that's the particular factor I didn't cover a lot on because it's just straightforward Russell times soil test P. So in the final calculation, there are 3 transport pathways or summed. A 0.1 factor scales the transport function from 0 to 1. If you'll notice through all the transport functions, they were all scaled 0 to 10 because that's how the old index was, and we just figured people were used to looking at that risk on a scale of 0 to 10, right? 10 is bad, 0 is good as far as transport risk. But really the transport function should be like, conceptually this is how I think of it. It represents what percentage of your source can be transported, conceptually, right? So we just multiply by 0.1 to scale it to 0 to 1 like a percentage would be. If it's so therefore, if it comes out 0.8, that means that 80% of your source can be expressed. If it comes out to 0.2, 20% of your source is expressed. So that's all that 0.1 is to scale it. You add the 3 factors, and that's your final score. So we continue to work on this. So a little bit about our current efforts, because there's been a lot of discussion about this. We continue constantly to evaluate the PMT, always have. The work on it's never stopped since the first one was released in 1998. In 2005, there was a revision, and hardly anyone noticed. This one was a little more drastic, so everyone kind of noticed. And we just continue to evaluate it to make it more accurate and precise. We're trying to see how it'll behave. Obviously, this has not been released. We don't have 9,000 runs of this like we do the old ones, so we don't know what it'll do. And that's why, while it hasn't been implemented yet, I imagine the implementation strategy will be such, and I think Royden will talk about this, that it'll incorporate some sort of rollout so that we can kind of get our fingers around how it's going to behave. We are working to calibrate the PMT against validated field P-loss models. Again, these are good field loss models. I know everyone gets really nervous when we talk about models because they think about the Chesapeake Bay model and all the bad press it gets, but these are pretty good models that are out there. And we want to make sure it's directionally and magnitudinally correct, right? We can't go to every field and measure phosphorus loss, all right? That would be the best. If I go to 1,000 fields, measure phosphorus loss, run the PMT on them, they should all line up. As PMT goes up, phosphorus loss goes up. Can't do that. It costs billions of dollars. So there's these models that are developed on real-world runoff studies that predict phosphorus loss. And so if we run a model on a field and run the PMT and then line them all up, it's kind of the same thing as actually going out and measuring phosphorus loss. And we want to see that when we predict there's going to be more phosphorus loss, we want the PMT risk factor to go up. So directionally and magnitudinally correct. A little bit about accuracy and precision, because there's a lot of talk about this with the PMT and where we are versus where we were. So on the left is high precision and low accuracy. All right, if any of you are shooters or hunters, you kind of know what I mean here. You can group your shots really tightly, but how do you know if you're actually hitting the bullseye, right? You got to have some sort of external measure of what is accurate, what is the actual target. And then low precision and high accuracy. So low precision means I can't group them very tightly, but if you look at all those bullets on the right, all those holes on the right, the average of those is the bullseye. So on average, I was exactly correct. But there's a cost to a lack of precision, right? Lack of precision actually has a cost. If we think about this in terms of the P-index, if we're shooting for what is the actual risk and we shoot low, there's an environmental risk because we allow high phosphorus application to that field, and there's high phosphorus loss because we predicted the risk as being low and it was actually high. But if we look at this guy up here, we predicted the risk was high, 100, cut off phosphorus application, and there was probably a significant economic impact on that farmer because he had to transport that manure off site, and his risk wasn't that high. So lack of precision or accuracy, either one, can be very bad, can have a cost, and so we're going to try and get this to be as precise and as accurate as possible. That's always been the objective of the P-index. It was a stated objective back in the early 90s when the first one was ever written, was to be fair and accurate. And so some of this is some graduate student work that's going on. Nicole's in the back of the room, she'll explain it later. We're looking at this dissolved phosphorus loss from just the manure, let's say. So this model will pick out where the phosphorus is even coming from. Our P-index is just broken up into surface dissolved P, surface particulate P, and subsurface dissolved P. But the model actually breaks it up as surface dissolved P originating from applied manure, originating from the soil, or originating from fertilizer. And so we look at it and we say, we want these two to line up really tight. Now, generally, directionally, they're correct. As the manure DP loss predicted by the model goes up, so does the PMT risk. But we see that it's diverging based on type of manure. We see that there's a lot of scatter. We're predicting that the phosphorus loss is 60 kilograms per hectare, and we're getting anything from a low to a high score on the PMT. Now, some of this is kind of a complicated modeling thing, and you see those numbers go up way high to 1,600, and so some of these are unrealistic factors. There's a certain kind of statistical approach for this, but generally we want to get this tighter, right? Because right now we kind of have this lack of accuracy around what the true phosphorus loss would be, and this is what we're working to kind of address in our research currently. The last thing I'd say is for those of you interested in precision ag, I'm going to have a selfless plug here. August 6th, 2014, on the Eastern Shore, I believe the Caroline County 4-H Park, but I'm not sure that we've settled on the location yet. But August 6th, 2014, put it in your calendar, save the day. It's a ton of fun. How many of you have been there to the Precision Ag Field Day before? How many of you think it's a good day? Had a good time there? Yeah. It's a fun day. If you're interested in precision ag, we bring in ag engineers. You don't have to listen to us talk. You actually get to listen to people talk about equipment. It's a good time. So anyway, put that in your calendar. With that, I think I've left 15 minutes for questions, if my watch is right. So, why is distance a factor for the runoff transport? Well, so what that distance factor measures is the contributing area. So contributing area, picture a map of a stream. Actually giving me an idea for a slide here. So you've got a map of the landscape and there's a stream that runs through that landscape. There's only a certain area around that stream that contributes to that stream. And so that distance factor assesses the likelihood. It's based on the probability that you are in that contributing area for a certain return period threshold on a storm. And I believe they said it at a 100-year storm when they calculated that. It was developed by hydrologists at the USDA ARS who worked on P-index things with us. It's part of the regional group that works on P-indexes. So it's that contributing area to that stream. As you move away from that stream, the probability that water that hits this spot gets to the stream goes down, because water goes through a lot of processes before it gets to the stream. If it infiltrates, it's going to lose its phosphorus and not get to the stream. Evaporates, obviously, it's not going to get to the stream. So it's direct runoff. What's the area around the stream that directly contributes through runoff, water running right into that stream? So that's the distance factor for surface runoff. Does that make sense? In the back, red shirt, yes. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Okay, so the question is, I'll repeat it back. What if at the 100 feet mark, the field is sloped away from the stream? So the way that it is calculated is the contributing distance is along the slope pathway to the stream. So it's only on the slope going towards the stream. If it slopes away, then you calculate it going in the other direction. Then it's the direction that the water flows. You're measuring a line from the edge of the field in the direction the water flows to the nearest water body. So you take, if the water is flowing this way, I draw, and this is the edge of my field, I'm going to draw a line to the surface water body and measure that distance in the direction that water is flowing. Where's Dr. Steinhilber? That's the way you interpret correctly. The correct when you guys do distance to water, it's the flow path. It's the distance of the flow path. That's right, it's the direction of flow. You measure the travel path of a drop of water. It's the direction of flow. Yes, sir, right here. What happens to phosphorus and riparian buffers? That's the question. Studies of accumulation of phosphorus and riparian buffers. There's volumes of studies on this, and there's conflicting answers. It's not, so the question is, how do riparian buffers handle phosphorus saturation? So, but not just riparian buffers, but just buffer zones in general. So the concept is with the buffer is that it's filtering or slowing surface runoff and increasing infiltration. Okay. If you have high dissolved P at the soil surface in that riparian buffer, there's a potential for desorption of that phosphorus and then it's then transported away. So the risk that's being questioned here is, are you increasing risk by having a buffer around the stream because you've saturated that? So this is what I would say to that. That's why we don't include the buffer as being beneficial in subsurface dissolved P transport. In a vegetated buffer as described here, the potential for dissolution of phosphorus from that soil is low because you have vegetation and hopefully infiltration. You can accumulate to a point where then it's not stopping in P, and we're giving you credit for slowing down flow. So the buffer doesn't increase, the buffer only decreases your score. So there is a risk that we are giving you credit and saying this buffer is good, it reduces phosphorus loss, and you're actually contributing. There is a risk, but it's very small. The other thing is it's used in the particulate P, which is just filtration of the sediment particles. You can get confluence through buffers, so you can actually get around pastures, particularly there's been a lot of research out of New Zealand that buffers around pastures actually cause confluence and increases in velocity. And when water velocity increases, the potential for phosphorus transport increases as well. So under that scenario, realistically, if we had a more accurate tool, the buffer would be bad for you and make your score go up. But really the P index is an assessment, a thumbnail assessment of generally what usually happens in the world. And I would say around here in our landscape, 98% of the time, that buffer is a good thing and reduces phosphorus transport. There has been a lot of research on the lower eastern shore about using buffers to intersect dissolved P transport in that subsurface pathway. And what's been found is if you do really deep tillage in that buffer to mix high iron and aluminum, low P soil in with the surface soil, that helps to decrease that phosphorus transport. And we've discussed in future versions of the P index actually giving credit for a managed buffer like that, or a buffer where you add phosphorus sorbent materials to increase the size of the cup in that buffer to hold P. But I mean, it is a concern, but in general, we're looking at what is the mean behavior of that buffer. And in general, the average buffer is good to intersect surface runoff. Additional questions? There were some more hands, I think. We got a couple more hands. Yes, sir. So if I can summarize that, actually, a large majority of that work is mine. The comment was about on the lower eastern shore at UM-PMT, working with USDA, ARS, P-Climb, and Rainbow Iron. Some people, there's a large group of us that have worked on phosphorus sorbent materials. And you can either apply phosphorus sorbent materials to the surface of the soil to decrease phosphorus solubility in the soil surface. Gypsum, for example, would be a way to do this. Or the phosphorus trapping filters in the ditch, which is what we've done oodles of research on, where you actually have a structure filled with steel slag, which is comes out of steel industry, calcium hydroxide and oxides, or gypsum, which is calcium sulfate in a bed filter, or water treatment residuals, which have iron and aluminum. We use acid mine drainage treatment residuals. So a phosphorus trapping material in the filter in that ditch. Because the reality of the situation is on the lower eastern shore, in a ditch drained field with high phosphorus saturation, you're probably looking at 200 to 300 years before phosphorus levels go down coming out of the field. If I stop application today, it took a long time to get in trouble, it takes a long time to get out of trouble. There's some people in the room today who actually have these phosphorus filters on their farm to help us with that research. And so the question is, why isn't that in this version of PMT? I will say the next iteration, phosphorus trapping filters will be in as a management option to reduce your score. Probably your subsurface component will be decreased by 20 to 30%. We're actually having a meeting next week where those will be discussed, but it'll probably be a credit of 20 to 30% in subsurface P transport. And even in surface dissolved P, if you can take all your runoff and confine it to one area, like a pond or something, you put a filter in. And then we talked to, a couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation with Art Allen from UM-PMT, that's who you referred to. Dr. Allen is continuing to do some work on surface application of gypsum. It does decrease your soil phosphorus saturation in the surface, can decrease subsurface transport of dissolved P by increasing that capacity of the soil. And so he doesn't have any data yet on how much the decreases are in runoff, but in the ditch structures with the gypsum and with the curtains, we actually have a lot of runoff data. So that is incorporated in kind of the working version. I'm familiar with that material. It's a liming material. It's basically calcium carbonate. The problem is that it'll actually increase phosphorus loss because it raises the pH of the soil. And in acidic soils where iron and aluminum predominantly hold the phosphorus, if you apply a liming material with a carbonate group, it will actually increase phosphorus loss from the soils. That's why they actually use the gypsum. The calcium sulfate buffers the pH, but doesn't change the pH. And when the calcium sulfate disassociates, the calcium will sorb the phosphorus. So we've got to be careful because calcium carbonates will increase the dissolved P component. But the crop yield response problem they have is just over application. If you keep your applications below 10 tons per acre, you'll have no problems. What happens is when you go over 10 tons per acre, you add enough calcium to displace all the magnesium from the soil CEC, and then you get magnesium deficiency and you lose yield, and that's what he referred to. Actually, my old college roommate published a paper on that yield loss study. Yep.
I'd just like to make a comment with regards to your statement of P transport 200 to 300 years before you see reduction in that. I would like to address our policymakers and our legislative bodies. We continuously say that we base our decisions on science. This is science speaking 200 to 300 years before you see a reduction of measurable quantities coming out. Do not have a knee-jerk reaction in legislation or policy within the next 2 to 3 years when you do not see these major reductions that the general public is expecting and create additional regulatory and legislative burdens to farming.
Let me address that because that deserves some clarification. So when we model soil phosphorus drawdown, that's based on soil phosphorus concentrations, and we see these, when you elevate soil phosphorus concentrations to very high levels, we predict that drawdown is extremely slow, as you pointed out. So I don't want to say that we know phosphorus loss won't come down, but in the near term, no one expects phosphorus loss to be significantly decreased because you stop applying manure tomorrow on these specific landscapes, particularly where subsurface dissolved peat transport occurs. So it's that specific landscape. Is surface runoff direct incidental transfer from manure? If I stop applying, that loss from that manure. So we got to be careful not to go one way or the other, because I hear a lot of rhetoric out of that environmental kind of community, and we got to be real specific, stay in our lane, and we don't expect soil test phosphorus to come down. We modeled that out many decades before that soil phosphorus saturation comes down, so that subsurface transport will continue more than likely.
Scientific community.
Hydrology and soil chemistry doesn't operate on 4-year time frames.